So a while ago, I was just at home watching YouTube, relaxing in the evening, and the suggested video came up called The Future of Music is Noise. It intrigued me, so I decided to give it a try. And though there's some really good content and salient points being made in it, over the course of the video, I started to become more and more frustrated with the narrative that was being presented. And I think because I'm kind of like a naturally critical person, I started making this response video. I was like, oh, there's all these details about music history that this guy didn't really consider. He didn't really even do like a particularly good job of explaining what noise music is. But then as I was kind of going through and doing more research, I started to realize that maybe I was being kind of naive about my analysis too. And the truth of the matter is that maybe I also didn't really know what noise music was either. But then as I dived deeper, I developed an even more radical thesis. It took some time, but now I think I've gathered what I need to argue that noise music, contrary to being the future, doesn't even really exist. In the summer of 1982, a movable music festival called New Music America came to an auditorium at Navy Pier in Chicago, Illinois. An offshoot of an event called New Music New York, it was designed to showcase so-called avant-garde performances by new composers of 20th century contemporary music and sound artists associated with an organization called the New Music Alliance. While much of the information one can dig up about this event is somewhat contradictory, we do know for a fact that this marked one of the first live performances of a new piece by New York artist Glenn Branca titled Indeterminate Activity of Resultant Masses. Performed by an ensemble of electric guitarists that included future members of Sonic Youth, the group used specially prepared instruments strung with 6 high E strings. The piece is a rhythmically repetitive cacophony of jangly sounds that are occasionally accompanied by a simplistic percussion pattern not dissimilar to a march. It goes on for about half an hour, and throughout the piece, the voicings and rhythm each guitar plays shift slightly, generating a winding, droning sound that is somewhat hypnotic, but also, it is worth recognizing, extremely driving and repetitive. This performance came at a time when Branca was beginning to achieve broader musical popularity. After toiling in obscurity throughout most of the 1970s, his discovery of punk music had led him to begin experimenting with an adjacent sound people had begun to call no wave. 1980 would see him release his first album of his own solo compositions, and he would shortly thereafter found a label called Neutral Records, which would, among other albums, release some of the first few Sonic Youth records. Branca's approach to writing music wasn't exactly new. Since the turn of the 20th century, composers had been experimenting with modified and non-traditional instruments in their composition, as well as moving firmly beyond the standards of tonal harmony that had been developed in the 1700s. That being said, there were those who saw his contributions and that of others in the nascent New York no-wave scene as part of a distinct movement within the so-called avant-garde. And additionally, a lot of people thought of this as not necessarily a good thing. Criticisms of Branca's work were growing with his popularity, and there was no shortage of musicians that were contributing to this discourse. One such individual was legendary composer John Cage, who at that point was quite old and had a long career behind him of composing music that, realistically, was not all too dissimilar to Branca's. However, after witnessing the performance of Indeterminate Activity at New Music America, he gave an interview with fellow contemporary composer Wim Martens, where he spoke at length about how troubled he was by the performance. Among other accusations, Cage stated, "My feelings were disturbed. The Branca piece is an example of sheer determination, of one person to be followed by the others. Say it was good intentions he was expressing with vehemence and power. It would be like one of those strange religious organizations that we hear about. If it was something political, it would resemble fascism." Martens, the interviewer, pushes back against Cage's accusations, but Cage largely refuses to accept an alternate perspective on the matter and closes the interview by claiming that Branca's music is symbolic of a larger cultural political trend that deeply concerns him, citing growing popular support of authoritarianism and narcissistic behavior as products of the same social undercurrent that has buoyed the no-wave movement. Branca himself found this exchange interesting, or perhaps funny enough to include the recording as a track on a subsequent album that he himself released. Regardless of motivation, it suggests he neither took the criticism too seriously, nor believed that it would result in any bad press for him as an artist, and by and large, he was mostly correct. Over the some 40 years since the interview was released, popular sentiment toward Cage's comments mostly follows Branca's seemingly amused, unconcerned tone. Perusing the YouTube comments under posted recordings of the interview will mostly reveal people treating Cage as having an old man yells at cloud moment in his conversation with Martins. And it should be noted that his defense of Branca's music as fascist is somewhat contradictory and muddled. For one, Cage failed to notice that the musicians were reading off of sheet music, and makes a big deal over how this suggests that they were under Branca's complete control instead of interpreting something communicated, which Martins immediately counters by pointing out that there was, in fact, a written score for the piece that they did use. A big part of Cage's defense of his own music in comparison also involves referring to what could best be described as vague or non-declarative Buddhist maxims, which doesn't feel particularly informative in terms of identifying what would set each approach apart. That being said, as I listened to the interview, I really can't help but agree with some of Cage's points. While a lot of what he states is easily refuted or far too vague to really count as any kind of substantive claim, there are a few arguments he makes that actually feel kind of salient. I also feel like Cage is maybe not treated as fairly as he should be in people's criticism of the interview. For one, he was pretty old when it took place. It's obvious he's having a hard time staying on track as he presents his argument. Additionally, as far as I know, he probably never really thought much of an audience outside of a narrow circle of contemporary composers would ever really hear the recording, as it was originally just released by Martins as part of a short series of artists on art type interviews about the festival itself. One thing that Cage notices that I think is actually a fair criticism is that Branca and a lot of the contemporary composers he gets associated with are typically considered indivisible from the music they make. As Cage puts it, Branca has to have Branca, meaning that the performances of his pieces almost always had Glenn himself as an ensemble member or a conductor. This is in sharp contrast to Cage's work, in which Cage oftentimes concerned himself with and prioritized making things as communicable as possible so as to ensure a piece did not need him to be involved to seem authentic. I think Cage also makes a fair comparison to the music of Wagner as he frames Branca's music as one of a perpetual climax. 19th century composer Richard Wagner was in many ways the father of tonal expansion at the end of the classical period, and additionally, his compositions relied on this approach to increase the impact of their sort of climactic moments. These techniques were critical to the development of modern age musical aesthetics, and importantly, Wagner saw his adoption of these techniques back then as forming some kind of historical disjunction between his music and previous Romantic era classical composer. Branca similarly saw his own compositional approach as making a break with both popular and avant-garde predecessors of the 20th century. For additional support of the parallels between Branca and Wagner's methods, we can look at the ways in which Wagner's approach toward composition, as well as that of the no wave and related movements, resembled and became associated with cinematic language through use in film soundtracks. Wagner's composition Ride of the Valkyries, in particular, has been utilized as a soundtrack accompaniment in film dozens of times. Beginning with the controversial pro-slavery epic silent film Birth of a Nation, directed by D.W. Griffith. Similarly, offshoots of the no-wave movement and related genres such as industrial have also become popular for use in film. Trent Reznor, for instance, the primary member and founder of Nine Inch Nails, has found a significant amount of work producing film scores. Michael Gira, an acolyte of Branca's, titled one of his Swans projects Soundtracks for the Blind, and followed it up with a side project record called Number 1 of 3, which was billed as a soundtrack without a film upon its release. And J.G. Thirlwell, a one-time member of the seminal and controversial power electronics group White House, which drew from many of the same musical and philosophical influences as Branca, would go on to compose scores for television after leaving his noise music career behind. This idea of Wagner's music being cinematic seems strange because, after all, Wagner died well before movies even existed, but no shortage of music and film theorists have made the connection between his approach to composition and the eventual advent of film scoring. In particular, many point to Wagner as a progenitor of the idea that the musical score of a theatrical performance can itself inform the narrative and help the audience understand the story better. This shift from music being part of the narrative is key to philosopher Theodor Adorno's assessment of Wagner and his relationship with the concept of modernity. Adorno, a German Jew who was forced to flee Germany following the rise of Nazism, was fascinated with Wagner's popularity amongst fascists of the day and spent a good deal of energy attempting to articulate what it was about his music that was so popular with authoritarians. While that exploration led him to form many theories, one of the most informative for our own purposes was probably his recognition of Wagner's reliance on a hero narrative where the central character of the story sacrifices everything in the name of his own values, which are treated as unquestionably important due to his dedication. Simultaneously, he consistently portrays antagonists in stories as wholly unsympathetic, generally to the point of being depicted as deformed and essentially ontologically evil, oftentimes making use of anti-Semitic stereotypes. It's worth mentioning that this extreme moral narcissism projected by Wagner's music was seen as downstream of historical processes by Adorno. In the early 19th century, patronage of the opera by royalty was dying with the concept of feudalism itself, and many new governments had not taken up the same interest in producing sponsored works. The result is that many composers like Wagner, who had before been part of a tight-knit group of high society artists, were now very much on their own, forced to establish the funding for their creations by themselves, and without much of a clue as to where to look for support. In Wagner, at least, this turn of events undoubtedly contributed to his me against the world attitude and hyperinflated sense of self-importance, which was married with a strong resentment of the political space he found himself in. Like a lot of people in Europe who were struggling to make sense of nascent industrialism and the birth of a new economic mode, he eventually resorted to scapegoating Jewish people to explain both broader geopolitical trends and additionally why he himself also struggled to find success. So, in the birth of the modern age, we have this massive crisis of authority. Who is the person that gets to decide what's right and wrong? How should people act? What does it mean to be a community outside of feudalism? All of these questions are creating an identity crisis for a lot of people in Europe. And at least for people of Wagner's political persuasion, the solution to finding meaning was to look inward towards a concept of pure self-expression within themselves. Prior to this, the concept of self-expression, or the importance of a human being as a self-sufficient entity, wasn't really popular anywhere. And alongside this new mentality, people became increasingly critical of anything viewed as an antiquated standard by which things were done. The concept of everything needing to be young and new and radical and transgressive became more critical to the process of locating both truth in society and truth within the self. While this mentality might seem like the basis for exactly the kind of historical disjuncture that Wagner stylized his art as part of, some closer examination reveals that in a lot of ways, this ostensible new form of thought, known as modernity, was more or less a recapitulation of old forms of political domination repackaged in a more personalized shell. We can see this even in the way that Wagner's operas typically included stories that were drawn from old folk tales that he wanted to make seem more German as a result of his own nationalist politics. In a sense, the manner in which he tells these stories is radical because it utilized harmonic forms that were extremely uncommon in Europe, and it also contributed to the formation of a national identity from whole cloth. But on another level, Wagner's political interests lay almost exclusively in trying to hold on to old political hierarchies through repackaging ancient and tired stereotypes. In this context, we can very easily see how Adorno looked at Wagner's work and remarked, "It is doubtless true that toward the close of the 19th century, the music that swept people off their feet did so because it combined drastic ideas with conventionality. In doing so, it satisfied the demands of the cinema before cinema was invented." By the early 20th century, Wagner's experimentation with both tonal expansion beyond the 18th and 19th century European standards and music as an intentionally political tool had led to a wide array of so-called avant-garde composers experimenting in a new space that had been coined noise music by early Italian futurists. Enamored with both the cacophony of industrialism and, oftentimes, the raw power of fascist thought, these artists sought to use both traditional and non-traditional instruments, including homemade noise-making machines, to produce music that they viewed as a middle finger toward historical practice up to that point. Rather than embrace the lessons of history, they would instead embrace youth, self-expression, and technological development. The justification for calling this new music noise was born out of a belief that humans, who now lived in a world where they were much more frequently exposed to sounds from the industrial urban environments they found themselves in, would become habituated to what had been previously considered obnoxious sound. In previous centuries, noise was fairly uncommon as a term, and typically it only described unwanted, usually human-produced sounds that were disruptive or annoying, as in a heated argument, for instance. Futurists thought that habituation to this noise meant that people would eventually come to desire music that resembled it, and this meant that organized music had to become more reliant on the sounds of factories and machines. In the rejection of older forms of musical theory, they also sought to assert a new personal authority. There was no need to go to music school to make noise music. In fact, it was probably better that one didn't receive any so-called traditional music schooling. It's pretty easy to see a parallel between the criticality of the individual within Wagner's music and early noise music, as well as a parallel to the observation that Cage makes about Glenn Branca nearly 100 years later. In all of these musical trends, we can clearly identify a declared rejection of association with musical history and a reassertion of self-importance in its place. The exchange between Cage and Martins towards the end of the 1982 interview is particularly interesting because it identifies precisely the problem with emphasizing reliance on self-importance as creative guidance. Cage asks Martins what he thinks is interesting about Branca's piece, and Martins responds, "It has to do with non-communication. It's like a scream. It's hopeless. It's only about energies. It's an accumulation of energies without content, without dialectics, and without communication, without feedback. It's very libidinal." Cage then asks Martins if the music is erotic, to which Martins says yes, but then he also admits that because it is an attempt at some level of pure self-reference, that this is only an eroticism in regard to itself, which he also agrees makes the piece intentionally narcissistic. Cage then, after a brief pause, asks a final question. "Then of what use is it?" To which Martins responds, "It's probably useless." So what's my overall point here? How does all of this evidence suggest that noise music doesn't exist? Well, to begin with, the concept of noise, technically speaking, refers to sounds that are randomly generated in the environment. The unexpected signal generated in an electrical circuit is noise. An attempt to intentionally reproduce such random sound immediately fails because human intention enters the equation. We are no longer experiencing something unexpected and involuntarily generated. It is being intentionally created, and thus, what we are hearing is no longer noise. It is, like everything else intentionally created in a sonic space by humans for aesthetic appreciation, just music. Why is this an important distinction? Well, if we reject the notion that what we are creating is part of a historical progression, we're making an attempt at forming a historical disjunction. In most cases, such an action or a declaration is done to make a creation or a moment seem more important than other moments. In reality, however, there are no such disjunctions. It's impossible to escape the sphere of historical influence. Aesthetics, culture, society at large are a result of social historical production of ideas and political movements. Wanting to remove oneself from that trend may seem attractive, in particular because it sets you, the all-important you, apart from the procession of history. However, that attempt will never be successful. In reality, doing so will only rob your identity of the content that forms the self. It may feel validating to create such a personal piece of artwork, but what utility does the individual have outside of any sort of context? As Martins admits, such creative endeavors are useless. We are only made of the things that we experience and influence us. Music, for instance, has always gone through expansions in tonality and explorations of how features beyond simple harmony, such as rhythm and timbre, can influence a composition. Therefore, the music of Glenn Branca is no more noise than the music of Wagner or Mozart, for that matter. For this reason, there's really only two possibilities. Either everything is noise, or more accurately, I believe, everything is music, and noise music just doesn't exist.